I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The first time I laid eyes on her, it was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath in reverence for the sight before me. I was sitting on the shore, the evening sun casting a warm, golden glow over everything it touched. The sea stretched out before me, calm and vast, reflecting the hues of the setting sun in a shimmering display of gold and orange. The air was cool, with just a hint of salt, and the gentle sound of waves lapping against the rocks was a soothing backdrop to my quiet thoughts. It was one of those rare, perfect moments where everything felt right with the world, a moment that seemed almost too serene to be disturbed. But then, she appeared. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. There was a figure in the water, just a shadow against the brilliant light of the setting sun. My eyes squinted against the glare, trying to make out the details. As the figure moved closer, emerging from the water, I could finally see her clearly, and what I saw took my breath away. She was unlike anyone I had ever seen. Her hair, long and raven black, cascaded down her back, wet and glistening, catching the light in a way that made it look almost ethereal. Her skin was a warm, glowing caramel, smooth and flawless, as if sculpted by the hands of the gods themselves. But it was her eyes that truly captivated me, brilliant, crystal green eyes that sparkled like emeralds, vibrant and alive, full of a mysterious depth that I couldn't begin to understand. As she stepped onto the shore, the water clinging to her like a lover reluctant to let go, she moved with a grace that was almost unnatural, each step fluid and effortless. It was as if she wasn't walking at all, but rather gliding over the sand, her movements so smooth and elegant that it seemed like the earth itself was making way for her. My breath caught in my throat, my heart hammering in my chest as I watched her approach. She was mesmerizing, a vision of such beauty that I could hardly believe she was real. It felt as though I had stumbled upon something sacred, something not meant for mortal eyes, and yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. Every part of me was drawn to her, compelled by a force that I couldn't explain, a need to be closer to this otherworldly creature who had suddenly appeared in my world. There was something timeless about her, something ancient and powerful, as if she belonged to a different era, a different realm altogether. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, with a kind of magic that I could feel even from a distance. It was as though she carried with her the secrets of the sea, of the world beneath the waves, a world I had never known, but suddenly longed to explore. She looked at me then, and I felt a jolt of electricity race through me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, it was as if everything else faded away, the sound of the waves, the warmth of the sun, the cool breeze on my skin, all of it disappeared, leaving just the two of us in a silent, suspended moment. Her gaze was intense, piercing, as though she could see right through me, down to my very soul. And yet, there was a softness there too, a gentle curiosity that made my heart ache with a longing I had never known before. I didn't understand it at the time, but there was something dangerous in that gaze, something that should have warned me to be cautious. But in that moment, I was completely unaware of the peril that lay beneath her beauty, oblivious to the threat she posed. All I could think about was how desperately I wanted to know her, to understand her, to be close to her in a way I had never wanted with anyone before. It was as if she had cast a spell over me, drawing me in with her beauty, her mystery, her undeniable presence. I felt an overwhelming need to reach out to her, to touch her, to make sure she was real and not some figment of my imagination. But I was frozen in place, too mesmerized to move, too captivated to think clearly. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she here, in this place, at this time? But none of that mattered in that moment. All that mattered was her, and the way she made me feel, alive, awake, and utterly, hopelessly enthralled. She took a step closer, and I felt my pulse quicken, a thrill of excitement and anticipation running through me. But even as she approached, there was a part of me that recognized the danger, a small voice in the back of my mind that whispered caution. There was something about her that was too perfect, too flawless, something that didn't quite belong in the world I knew. But that voice was drowned out by the sheer intensity of my desire to be near her, to be a part of whatever it was that made her so irresistibly captivating. When she finally stopped, just a few feet away from me, I could hardly breathe. Her presence was overwhelming, filling the space between us with a palpable energy that made my skin tingle. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. I was lost in her gaze, drowning in the depths of those emerald eyes, unable to think, unable to move. And then, she smiled, a small, enigmatic smile that only deepened the mystery of who she was. It was a smile that held secrets, that promised more than I could ever imagine, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a strange mix of emotions, exhilaration, wonder, and a flicker of fear. But the fear was fleeting, quickly buried beneath the wave of longing that surged through me. In that moment, I was completely and utterly captivated by her, unaware of the danger that lurked beneath the surface, blind to the truth of who she really was. All I knew was that I wanted to be with her, to be a part of whatever world she came from, to lose myself in the magic that surrounded her. I didn't care about the risks, didn't care about the unknown. I was ready to follow her anywhere, to do anything, just to be near her. And as she turned and walked back into the water, disappearing beneath the waves as suddenly as she had appeared, I was left standing there, alone on the shore, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I knew I had to see her again, had to find her, had to understand the connection that had formed between us in that brief, breathtaking moment. But I had no idea then just how dangerous that connection would be, no idea that my life would be forever changed by that first, fateful encounter. All I knew was that I was hopelessly, irrevocably drawn to her, and that nothing would stop me from finding her again, no matter the cost. The first time she tried to kill me is a memory that haunts me, not just because of the danger I was in, but because of the profound confusion and disbelief that followed. I had been so captivated by her beauty, so entranced by her presence, that the possibility of harm hadn't even crossed my mind. Yet, that day, I learned just how dangerous she truly was, and it left me questioning everything I thought I knew. After our first encounter, I couldn't stay away. I returned to the same spot by the shore again and again, hoping to catch another glimpse of her. Each time I visited, I was filled with a strange mix of anticipation and longing, as though seeing her had become an addiction I couldn't shake. My mind was consumed with thoughts of her, those piercing green eyes, the raven black hair, the grace with which she moved. I couldn't understand why she had such a hold on me, but I knew I had to see her again. And then, one evening, as the sun was setting, she appeared once more. The sight of her emerging from the water sent a thrill through me, and I felt my heart leap in my chest. She was as mesmerizing as ever, her beauty more captivating than anything I had ever seen. But this time, there was something different in her eyes, a coldness, a darkness that hadn't been there before. It should have been a warning, but I was too blinded by my obsession to see it. She moved toward me with the same fluid grace, her gaze fixed on mine, and I felt that familiar pull, the irresistible force that made me want to be near her. My heart was pounding, and I found myself taking a step toward her, unable to resist the magnetic attraction that drew me in. But as I approached, she began to sing. Her voice was unlike anything I had ever heard, hauntingly beautiful, yet filled with a dark, hypnotic power that seemed to wrap around me like a fog. The melody was slow and seductive, pulling at something deep within me, stirring emotions I didn't fully understand. I felt an overwhelming urge to follow her, to step into the water and let it carry me away. My feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward her as though I were in a trance. But as I moved closer, something inside me resisted. It was like a part of me, buried deep within, was fighting against the pull of her song. My feet faltered, and I found myself frozen in place, unable to take another step. Confusion washed over me. Why couldn't I move? Why wasn't I following her? I wanted to, more than anything, but my body refused to obey. Her song grew louder, more insistent, and I could see the frustration growing in her eyes. She took another step toward me, her voice rising in intensity, but still, I couldn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind swirling with conflicting emotions. I wanted to follow her, wanted to give in to the temptation of her song, but something deep inside me was holding me back, something I couldn't control. As she realized that her song wasn't working, I saw a flash of anger in her eyes, a cold fury that sent a shiver down my spine. The air around us seemed to grow colder, the light dimming as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her expression twisted into one of rage, her beautiful features contorting with frustration. I had never seen anything so terrifying, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of fear. And then, suddenly, she stopped singing. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. She stared at me, her emerald eyes burning with anger, and I could see the question in her gaze. Why wasn't I responding? Why wasn't I following her like all the others? I wanted to answer, wanted to explain, but I didn't have the words. I was as confused as she was, unable to understand why her deadly song had no effect on me. For a moment, we stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. Her gaze was sharp, cutting through me like a blade, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I realized then that she had intended to harm me, that her song was meant to lure me to my death. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt a wave of disbelief and horror wash over me. How could this beautiful, enchanting creature be so deadly? How could she have wanted to kill me? But even as the truth began to sink in, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Despite the danger, despite the fear that now gripped me, I was still drawn to her, still captivated by the mystery that surrounded her. I knew I should have turned and run, should have gotten as far away from her as possible, but I couldn't. I was trapped, caught between the allure of her beauty and the terror of what she had just tried to do. Eventually, the anger in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a look of confusion and curiosity. She tilted her head, studying me as if I were some kind of puzzle she couldn't solve. Her frustration gave way to intrigue, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out why I was different, why her song hadn't worked on me. It was as if I had become a challenge to her, something she couldn't quite grasp. And in that moment, I realized that I had become more than just another victim to her. I was something new, something unexpected, and that made me important to her in a way I hadn't been before. It was a dangerous place to be, but I couldn't deny the thrill that came with it. I had survived her first attempt to kill me, and now I was determined to understand why. When she finally turned and disappeared back into the water, I was left standing alone on the shore, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened. The confusion was overwhelming. How could I have been so blind? How could I have been so captivated by her beauty that I didn't see the danger? And yet, despite everything, I found myself wanting to see her again, to confront the mystery that surrounded her, even if it meant putting my life at risk. As I walked back home that evening, I grappled with the conflicting emotions swirling inside me. I knew now that she was dangerous, that her beauty was a facade that hid something far more sinister. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the connection I felt to her, the pull that kept drawing me back. I was caught in a web of my own making, unable to break free, even as I realized just how close I had come to losing everything. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The memory of her song, the intensity of her gaze, the realization that she had tried to kill me, it all haunted my thoughts, keeping me awake at night, driving me back to the shore again and again. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't help myself. I had to understand why she had spared me, why I had survived when so many others hadn't. Looking back now, I can see how foolish I was, how blinded I was by my own obsession. But at the time, all I knew was that I had to see her again, had to unravel the mystery that surrounded her, no matter the cost. And so, despite the danger, despite the fear that now lingered at the edges of my mind, I returned to the shore, ready to face whatever came next. After that first, fateful encounter, my life was irrevocably changed. The moment she disappeared into the waves, I was left standing on the shore, my mind a chaotic swirl of emotions. The realization that she had tried to kill me, and that I had somehow resisted, left me with more questions than answers. I couldn't make sense of what had happened, couldn't understand why I had been spared when everything about her, her beauty, her song, her gaze, had been designed to draw me to my death. In the days that followed, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. My thoughts were consumed by her, by the memory of her hauntingly beautiful face and the dark, hypnotic power she wielded. I was driven by a relentless need to understand, to figure out what had happened and why I had survived. It was as though she had cast a spell over me, one that didn't fade with her absence, but only grew stronger with time. I began returning to the shore every day, always at the same time, hoping to see her again. Each time I went back, I was filled with a strange mix of anticipation and dread, my heart pounding with the hope that she would appear, and the fear of what might happen if she did. I would sit by the water for hours, my eyes scanning the horizon, my ears straining to catch even the faintest whisper of her voice. But she didn't come. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of her. The longer she stayed away, the more my frustration grew. I couldn't understand it. Why had she spared me? Why hadn't her song worked? And why, after trying to kill me, had she simply disappeared, leaving me with nothing but questions and a deep, gnawing sense of longing? I felt like I was losing my mind, caught in a relentless cycle of confusion and obsession. As the weeks stretched into months, my search for her became an obsession. Every day, I would return to the same spot, hoping to find her there, hoping to unravel the mystery that had taken hold of my life. But each day, I was met with the same emptiness, the same aching disappointment. The sea was calm, the sky clear, but the sense of magic, of otherworldliness that had filled the air during our encounter, was gone. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Had she really tried to kill me, or had I misunderstood? Was it possible that I had simply been caught up in the moment, that my fear and confusion had distorted my perception of what had happened? But no matter how many times I replayed the events in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something profound and dangerous had taken place, something I needed to understand. My frustration grew with each passing day, and yet I couldn't bring myself to give up. There was something about her, something that called to me, that made it impossible for me to let go. I was drawn to her in a way I had never been drawn to anyone before, and the idea of never seeing her again, of never understanding what had happened between us, was unbearable. I needed answers, and I was willing to do whatever it took to find them. During this time, my life began to change in subtle but significant ways. My daily routines, fishing, tending to my garden, selling my catch to the village, became secondary to my search for her. I would wake up each morning with a sense of purpose, driven by the hope that today would be the day I found her. But as the months wore on, that hope began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching frustration that gnawed at me from the inside. I couldn't understand why she had spared me, why her song had failed to take hold of me. I knew that I was different, that my deafness and muteness set me apart from others, but I didn't see how that could have protected me from her deadly charms. I had always seen my disabilities as a burden, something that made me less than whole, but now they seemed to be the very thing that had saved my life. Yet, I couldn't make sense of it, couldn't reconcile the idea that my limitations might have been the key to my survival. As the months turned into a year, my frustration gave way to a kind of desperation. I began to question everything, including my own sanity. What if she had never been real? What if I had imagined the whole thing, conjured her up out of my own loneliness and longing? But even as I entertained these thoughts, I knew, deep down, that she was real, that our encounter had been more than just a figment of my imagination. I could still feel the weight of her gaze, the pull of her presence, the way her song had wrapped around me like a fog. And so, I continued my search, driven by a mix of curiosity, longing, and unresolved feelings that I couldn't begin to untangle. I was lost in a sea of emotions, unable to move forward, unable to let go. The more time passed, the more I realized that I was no longer just searching for her, I was searching for something within myself, something that had been awakened by our encounter and that refused to be silenced. During the second year of my search, I began to notice changes in myself. I was no longer the same man who had first laid eyes on her, no longer the simple fisherman content with his quiet life. My encounter with her had changed me in ways I hadn't fully understood, but as time went on, I began to see the world differently. I became more introspective, more aware of the forces that shaped my life, both seen and unseen. The ocean, once a source of comfort and sustenance, now held a deeper, more mysterious significance. It was no longer just a body of water, it was a gateway to something greater, something ancient and powerful that I was only beginning to comprehend. The frustration of not finding her, of not understanding why she couldn't kill me, only deepened my resolve. I knew that I was on the brink of something important, something that could change my life forever, and I was determined to see it through. I continued my search, driven by the hope that one day I would find her again, that I would finally get the answers I so desperately needed. And then, one evening, almost 2 years after our initial encounter, she appeared. I was sitting on the shore, as I had done countless times before, my eyes scanning the horizon, when I saw her. My heart leaped in my chest, and for a moment I was afraid she was just another figment of my imagination, a mirage born of my desperation. But as she drew closer, emerging from the water with that same fluid grace, I knew she was real. The sight of her filled me with a strange mix of emotions: relief, joy, fear, and anger. I had spent 2 years searching for her, driven by a need to understand, and now, here she was, standing before me as if no time had passed at all. But as she approached, I realized that something had changed. There was no anger in her eyes, no cold fury like before. Instead, there was a softness, a curiosity that mirrored my own. She stood before me, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other, two souls connected by something neither of us fully understood. The frustration, the confusion, the anger that had driven me for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm, of acceptance. I didn't know why her song had failed, didn't know why she had spared me, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that she was here, that we had found each other again, and that, somehow, we would find the answers together. And so, my search came to an end, not with the answers I had sought, but with the realization that some mysteries were meant to be unraveled slowly, over time. I had found her again, and that was enough for now. The journey was far from over, but at least, I no longer had to face it alone. After that first encounter where she had tried and failed to kill me with her hypnotic song, I was left reeling from the realization of how close I had come to death. The shock of her intent, mixed with the confusion of why I had been spared, lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Yet, despite the danger, despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, I found myself drawn back to the shore, time and time again. At first, each time I returned, her reaction was the same: anger. The moment she laid eyes on me, I could see the fury in her emerald green gaze. It was a cold, terrifying anger that seemed to radiate from her, an intense frustration that her attempts had failed. Each time she saw me, her eyes would narrow, her lips would press into a thin line, and I could feel the tension in the air, crackling like a storm ready to break. She would begin to sing again, her voice rising and falling with that same haunting melody that had nearly claimed me before. The sound was beautiful, mesmerizing, and yet I felt the familiar resistance within me, that mysterious force that kept me anchored in place, immune to her deadly charms. I watched as her anger flared, as she poured all her power into her song, trying desperately to make me succumb. But no matter how hard she tried, the result was always the same. I remained unaffected, standing there, confused and unsure of what to do. Her frustration was palpable. I could see it in the way she clenched her fists, in the way her eyes blazed with fury. She couldn't understand why I wasn't responding, why her song had no effect on me. For her, it was a mystery, a puzzle she couldn't solve, and it drove her to the brink of madness. I could see the rage simmering just beneath the surface, the way her whole body tensed as if she wanted to lash out, to do something, anything, to break through whatever it was that protected me. But as time passed, something in her began to change. Each time I returned, her anger seemed to diminish, little by little. The cold fury in her eyes softened, replaced by something more contemplative, more thoughtful. She would still sing, still try to ensnare me with her voice, but there was a difference now, a hesitancy, as if she wasn't entirely sure of what she was doing anymore. Her song became less intense, less driven by rage, and more by curiosity, as though she were testing me, trying to understand what made me different. I could sense the shift in her, the way her anger slowly gave way to curiosity. She would pause in her singing, her eyes studying me intently, searching for clues, for answers. I could see the questions in her gaze. Why wasn't I falling under her spell? What made me immune to her powers? And most importantly, why did I keep coming back? I asked myself the same questions, especially that last one. Why did I keep returning to her, knowing full well that she might try to kill me again? The logical part of my mind screamed at me to stay away, to avoid her at all costs. But there was something deeper, something far more powerful that drew me back to her, time and time again. I was captivated by her, by the mystery she represented, by the connection I felt whenever I was near her. It was as if I was caught in a web of my own making, unable to break free, even as I knew the dangers that awaited me. Every encounter with her was like walking a tightrope, a delicate balance between fear and fascination. I was fully aware that she could try to kill me at any moment, yet the allure of her beauty, the enigma of her existence, and the unspoken bond that seemed to grow between us, kept me coming back. Each time I saw her, I felt that pull a little stronger, that need to understand her, to get closer, despite the risk. As her anger faded, replaced by curiosity, our interactions became less about her trying to ensnare me and more about a mutual exploration of the unknown. She would watch me closely, her gaze intense and probing, as if trying to read my thoughts, to unravel the secret that kept me safe from her deadly song. I could see her struggling to understand, her frustration giving way to intrigue, as if I had become a challenge she couldn't resist. For my part, I found myself increasingly fascinated by her. The more I saw her, the more I wanted to know about her, who she was, where she came from, what drove her to lure men to their deaths. But even beyond those questions, there was something more, a connection I couldn't quite explain, a bond that seemed to grow stronger with each encounter. It wasn't just about the mystery anymore, it was about her, about the way she made me feel, about the strange, almost magnetic pull that drew me to her despite everything. There were times when I caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in her gaze, a flicker of emotion that was quickly hidden away, but it was enough to make me wonder if there was more to her than the cold, deadly creature I had first encountered. I began to see her not just as a threat, but as someone who was as much a mystery to herself as she was to me. And that realization only deepened my fascination with her. I knew that by continuing to seek her out, I was playing a dangerous game. I knew that one day, she might grow tired of her curiosity and decide to end things once and for all. But I couldn't stay away. The connection between us, the questions that lingered unanswered, the way she looked at me with those piercing green eyes, they all drew me back, again and again. As her anger transformed into curiosity, I found myself hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something more between us. Something beyond the fear, beyond the danger. I didn't know what that something was, or if it was even possible, but I was willing to take the risk to find out. And so, despite everything, I kept returning to her, driven by a need that went beyond logic, beyond reason, a need to understand her, to be near her, to see where this strange, dangerous connection would lead. There was a moment, one that I can recall with perfect clarity, when everything between us shifted. It was the moment when she stopped trying to kill me and, instead, reached out in a way that I never expected. It was the beginning of something new, something that felt as dangerous as it was thrilling. It was the start of our unconventional connection, one that would forever change the course of my life. It had been nearly 2 years since our first encounter, and by this point, our interactions had become almost routine. I would go to the shore, knowing full well that she might appear, and she would, more often than not, emerge from the water with that same mesmerizing grace, her eyes locked onto mine. She would begin to sing, her voice still hauntingly beautiful, but no longer filled with the same anger and frustration as before. Instead, there was a softness, a curiosity that had taken the place of her initial fury. But this time, something was different. I could sense it the moment she emerged from the water. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something significant was about to happen. She approached me as she always did, her eyes fixed on mine, but there was no song, no attempt to lure me into the depths. Instead, she stopped just a few feet away from me, and for a long moment, we simply stood there, staring at each other in silence. I felt my heart begin to race, my breath catching in my throat as I waited to see what she would do. The anticipation was almost unbearable, a mix of fear and excitement that made my hands tremble. I had grown accustomed to the danger she posed, had learned to live with the knowledge that each encounter might be my last, but this was something entirely new. She took a step closer, and I instinctively braced myself, expecting the worst. But instead of attacking, she reached out her hand and touched her lips, then slowly, gently, touched mine. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that it took me a moment to process what was happening. Her fingers were cool against my skin, and I felt a shiver run down my spine at the contact. It was the first time she had ever touched me, and the sensation was electric, sending a wave of warmth through my entire body. I stared at her, wide-eyed and confused, trying to make sense of what she was doing. Was this another trick? Another attempt to ensnare me in some new way? But as I looked into her eyes, I saw something different, something that made my breath catch in my throat. There was no anger, no malice, only curiosity. She was studying me, trying to understand me, and in that moment, I realized that she wasn't trying to harm me at all. She was trying to communicate. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind at once, and I felt a wave of conflicting emotions crash over me. I was stunned, relieved, and terrified all at once. For so long, I had seen her as a threat, a deadly force of nature that I had somehow survived, but now, as I looked into her eyes, I saw something more. I saw a being who was as curious about me as I was about her. I saw the spark of something that went beyond the danger, beyond the fear. I saw the beginnings of a connection. But with that realization came a new wave of fear, a fear that she would see me for what I was, different, flawed, unable to communicate in the way she expected. I had always been ashamed of my disabilities, had spent my life being treated as less than others because I was deaf and mute. And now, here was this otherworldly creature, trying to reach out to me in a way I couldn't reciprocate. I felt a deep sense of shame, a fear that she would see me as weak, as unworthy. I shook my head, trying to pull away, full of self-doubt and the crushing certainty that this was the moment I would lose her. But instead of recoiling, she did something that surprised me even more. She tilted her head to the side, her expression thoughtful, and then she slowly covered her ears with her hands, pointing to mine in turn. The realization of what she was asking hit me like a tidal wave. She was asking if I could hear her. My heart sank, and I felt a flush of embarrassment rise to my cheeks. Slowly, I shook my head, feeling the familiar sting of shame that always accompanied the admission of my disabilities. I expected her to pull away, to leave me standing there, humiliated and alone. But instead, her reaction was nothing like what I had anticipated. To my astonishment, her face lit up with a small, genuine smile, a smile that made my heart skip a beat. It was as if a light had gone on in her mind, as if she had finally found the answer she had been searching for. She nodded slowly, her expression one of understanding, and in that moment, I felt a surge of emotion so intense it nearly brought me to my knees. She didn't see me as weak. She didn't see me as less. She saw me, truly saw me, and accepted me for who I was. I could hardly believe it. For so long, I had been treated as an outsider, someone to be pitied or ignored. But here was this incredible, mysterious being, acknowledging my differences, and instead of turning away, she was reaching out to me. The relief, the gratitude, the sheer joy I felt was overwhelming. I had never experienced anything like it. I started to smile back at her, wanting to express the gratitude I felt, the hope that was blossoming in my chest. But before I could, she disappeared, slipping back into the water with a grace that left me breathless. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone, leaving me alone on the shore, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the sea, trying to process the flood of emotions that had overtaken me. She had reached out to me, had tried to communicate in a way that transcended words and sound. And I realized then that this was the beginning of something new, something that went beyond the deadly game we had been playing. It was the start of a connection, an unconventional, fragile connection that held the promise of understanding, of something deeper. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about that moment when she touched my lips, when she smiled at me with such genuine warmth. It was a moment that marked the end of her attempts to kill me and the beginning of something far more profound. I knew then that our encounters would never be the same, that we had crossed a threshold into uncharted territory. And as terrifying as that was, it was also exhilarating. I began to look forward to seeing her, not with the same trepidation as before, but with a growing sense of anticipation. Each time I returned to the shore, I wondered what new turn our connection would take, what new discoveries we would make about each other. There was still so much I didn't understand, so much that remained shrouded in mystery, but I was no longer driven by fear. Instead, I was driven by a desire to explore this connection, to see where it would lead us. And so, our unconventional relationship began, built not on words, but on gestures, on shared glances, on a growing understanding that transcended the barriers between us. It was a fragile, delicate thing, but it was real, and it was ours. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The moment she discovered I was deaf and mute is one that remains vivid in my memory, not just because of the fear that gripped me, but because of the unexpected compassion and understanding she showed in response. It was during one of our many encounters by the shore, where the rhythm of our meetings had begun to shift from the tense, dangerous exchanges of the past to something more complex, more uncertain. By this time, her attempts to kill me had become less frequent, replaced by a growing curiosity that seemed to puzzle even her. She had stopped singing to lure me in, and instead, she started observing me more closely, studying me with those brilliant green eyes that could pierce through my very soul. I could sense that something was building between us, a connection, a bond that neither of us fully understood. But with that connection came the creeping fear that it could all come crashing down the moment she realized the truth about me. The truth that I had managed to keep hidden from her, though not intentionally, that I was deaf and mute. For most of my life, I had been treated differently because of my disabilities. People would either avoid me altogether or treat me with pity, as if my inability to hear or speak made me somehow less human, less capable. It was a feeling I had grown accustomed to, though it never stopped stinging. The idea of her, this incredible, otherworldly being, discovering my secret and seeing me as weak or pathetic filled me with dread. I feared that the moment she knew, everything would change, that whatever fragile bond we had begun to form would shatter, and she would see me as just another broken man, unworthy of her attention. And then, the moment I had been dreading finally arrived. It began with her usual approach, emerging from the water with that graceful fluidity that never ceased to amaze me. But this time, instead of keeping her distance, she came closer than ever before. There was a new intensity in her gaze, a focused determination that set my heart racing. She reached out, touching her lips gently with her fingers, and then, to my surprise, she touched my lips in turn. The contact sent a shiver down my spine. Her touch was cool and soft, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I was stunned by the tenderness of the gesture, but at the same time, a wave of fear crashed over me. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to communicate, trying to bridge the gap that had always existed between us. But I also knew that I couldn't respond in the way she expected. I couldn't speak to her, couldn't even hear her voice if she tried to talk to me. The realization of what this meant, of what she would think of me once she knew, filled me with a deep sense of dread. I shook my head, trying to pull away, the familiar sting of shame rising in my chest. How could I explain to her that I was different, that I was unable to hear or speak? I had no way of conveying the truth to her, and the thought of her seeing me as weak, as less than whole, was almost too much to bear. I had spent so much of my life being treated as an outsider, as someone to be pitied or ignored, that the idea of her reacting the same way made my stomach twist with anxiety. But instead of withdrawing, she surprised me. She didn't look at me with pity or disappointment. Instead, she paused, her head tilting slightly to the side as if considering something. Then, slowly and deliberately, she covered her ears with her hands and pointed to mine. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight that nearly brought me to my knees. She was asking if I could hear her. My heart sank, and I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, shame, fear, and a deep, aching vulnerability. I had always tried to hide my disabilities from others, to mask the parts of myself that I knew people would see as flaws. But here, in this moment, there was no hiding, no pretending. I had to confront the reality of who I was, and I was terrified of what she would think. With a heavy heart, I slowly shook my head, signaling that I couldn't hear her. My gaze dropped to the ground, unable to meet hers, bracing myself for the reaction I had come to expect from others: disappointment, frustration, or worse, pity. I waited for that familiar look of sympathy, that patronizing expression that said I was somehow less because of my inability to communicate like everyone else. But what happened next took me completely by surprise. Instead of recoiling or turning away, her expression softened. She didn't look at me with pity or condescension. Instead, she offered me something I hadn't seen in a long time: understanding. Her eyes, those brilliant emerald eyes, lit up with a warmth that melted away my fear and shame. She nodded slowly, as if to say, "I understand," and the gentle smile that followed was filled with acceptance, not judgment. In that moment, I felt a wave of relief so powerful that it nearly overwhelmed me. She didn't see me as weak. She didn't see me as less. She saw me, truly saw me, for who I was, and accepted me anyway. The walls I had built up over the years, the defenses I had put in place to protect myself from the judgment of others, began to crumble in the face of her quiet compassion. The feeling of acceptance, of being truly seen for the first time in so long, was almost too much to bear. I felt a lump rise in my throat, and I struggled to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. She didn't pity me, she didn't look down on me. She simply accepted me as I was, and that simple act of kindness changed everything. Our connection, which had always been fragile and tenuous, suddenly deepened in a way I hadn't expected. There was a new understanding between us, a shared recognition of each other's vulnerabilities, and a mutual respect that hadn't been there before. I felt a bond forming, one that went beyond the physical, beyond the mysterious allure that had drawn me to her in the first place. It was a bond built on understanding, on acceptance, and on the realization that we were both, in our own ways, different from the world around us. From that moment on, our interactions were marked by a new sense of closeness. We still couldn't communicate in the traditional sense, but the barrier between us no longer felt insurmountable. Instead, we found new ways to connect, through gestures, through shared glances, through a growing understanding that didn't require words or sound. Our connection was unconventional, fragile, and still filled with uncertainty, but it was real. It was ours. And as I walked away from the shore that day, my heart lighter than it had been in years, I knew that I had found something special, something that went beyond the fear and the danger, something that was worth holding on to, no matter the risks. I had found someone who saw me, who accepted me for who I was, and in return, I was willing to accept her, despite the mysteries and dangers that surrounded her. In that moment, I realized that our connection, fragile as it was the start of something truly extraordinary. After that pivotal moment when she discovered I was deaf and mute, and responded with a warmth and understanding I never expected, I found myself overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. But as much as her acceptance touched me, it also left me with a profound sense of inadequacy that I couldn't shake. The fear that had lingered in the back of my mind for so long, that I was somehow unworthy of her, now consumed me. For days after that encounter, I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The way she had smiled at me, the way her eyes had softened with understanding instead of pity, it was all so different from what I had experienced before. Yet, instead of feeling uplifted, I felt a deep sense of shame. I was different, and no matter how much she seemed to accept that, I couldn't accept it myself. In the quiet moments of reflection, a cold realization began to settle over me: I was unworthy of her. Here was this beautiful, mysterious creature, so full of grace and power, who had tried to reach out to me despite everything, and what could I offer in return? I couldn't speak to her, couldn't hear her voice, couldn't even engage with her in the way others could. My disabilities, which I had spent my whole life trying to live with, now felt like insurmountable barriers, making me feel more isolated and disconnected than ever before. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that she deserved better, someone whole, someone who could meet her on her level. The fears that she would eventually see me as a burden, that her curiosity would turn to disappointment, became too much to bear. I couldn't stand the thought of seeing her look at me with the same pitying eyes I had seen from so many others. So, I made a decision that felt like it was tearing me apart even as I made it. I chose not to return to her. I convinced myself that it was for the best, that by staying away, I was sparing both of us from the inevitable heartbreak that would come when she realized I wasn't what she needed. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was running away, too scared to face the possibility that I might never be enough for her. It was easier, I told myself, to disappear quietly, to fade back into the life I had known before her, than to risk the pain of rejection. And so, I returned to my old life, a life that had once felt simple and content, but now felt suffocating and hollow. The routines that had once brought me peace, the early mornings on my small fishing boat, the quiet evenings tending to my garden, the solitary meals by candlelight, now felt empty, devoid of the meaning they once held. Everything reminded me of her, of the connection we had begun to forge, and of the loss I had inflicted upon myself by choosing to walk away. The days stretched into weeks, and each one felt heavier than the last. I tried to lose myself in my work, casting my nets and hauling in my catch as I always had, but even the ocean, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a vast, lonely expanse. The waves that once soothed me now only served to remind me of the distance I had placed between us, of the deep, unbridgeable gap I felt growing in my heart. Nights were the worst. Alone in my small, dimly lit cottage, I would sit by the window, staring out at the sea, the moonlight casting long shadows across the floor. I would imagine her out there, somewhere beyond the horizon, wondering if she thought of me as often as I thought of her. The loneliness was a constant, gnawing presence, one that no amount of work or distraction could ease. It was a loneliness not just of the body, but of the soul, a deep, aching void that I knew only she could fill. But I had chosen this path, hadn't I? I had decided that I was unworthy, that I couldn't offer her what she needed. And so, I forced myself to live with the consequences of that choice, even as it broke me down, piece by piece. I tried to convince myself that I was better off without her, that it was foolish to think that anything could ever come of our connection. But the more I tried to push her from my mind, the more she invaded my thoughts, haunting my dreams and filling my waking hours with a relentless sense of loss. It was as if she had become a part of me, a part one had willingly severed, and now I was left to bleed out the remaining fragments of my once peaceful life. Even the village, with its familiar faces and routines, felt different now. The villagers, who had always treated me with a kind of distant respect, seemed to sense the change in me. They would ask if I was all right, if something was troubling me, but I couldn't find the words to explain. How could I tell them that I had found something extraordinary, something that had touched me in a way nothing else ever had, and that I had thrown it away because I was too scared to embrace it? How could I explain the emptiness that now consumed me, the deep, unspoken grief that lingered in every corner of my soul? So I withdrew further, retreating into the solitude that had once been my refuge, but now felt like a prison. I avoided the shore, the place where we had met, the place that held too many memories, too much pain. Instead, I confined myself to the familiar paths around my home, going through the motions of a life that had lost its color and meaning. There were moments when I would catch myself staring out at the horizon, my heart aching with the longing to see her again. But each time, I forced myself to look away, to remind myself that I had made my choice, that there was no going back. The fear that she would see me as weak, as unworthy, was too great, and so I buried that longing deep inside, trying to forget, trying to move on. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the truth. I had lost her, not because she had rejected me, but because I had rejected myself. I had let my insecurities, my fears, and my self-doubt dictate my actions, and in doing so, I had thrown away the one thing that had brought light and meaning to my life. And now, I was left with nothing but the loneliness, the crushing weight of the choice I had made. The weeks turned into months, and still, the ache in my heart remained, a constant reminder of what I had given up. I tried to tell myself that it was for the best, that I had made the right decision, but the more time passed, the more hollow those words felt. The truth was, I missed her. I missed the way she looked at me, the way she tried to reach out, the way she made me feel alive in a way I had never felt before. I missed the connection we had begun to build, the promise of something more, something deeper, something extraordinary. And so, I lived with the loneliness, with the knowledge that I had let fear and self-doubt rob me of something precious. I lived with the regret, the what-ifs, the endless cycle of second-guessing that kept me awake at night, staring at the empty space beside me where she should have been. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it hollowed me out from the inside. I had chosen to walk away from her, believing I was unworthy, and in doing so, I had lost the one thing that could have made my life whole. And as the days continued to pass, one after another, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever find the courage to change that choice, to reach out to her again, or if I was destined to live the rest of my life in the shadow of that decision, forever haunted by the memory of what could have been. The day she came back was one I had thought about endlessly, yet never truly believed would happen. After months of living in self-imposed exile, convinced that I had lost her for good, I had resigned myself to a life of loneliness and regret. But all of that changed in an instant when she reappeared, shattering the solitude I had wrapped around myself like a protective cloak. It was an ordinary day, much like any other. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light over the water as the evening approached. I was in my small cottage, going through the motions of my daily routine, preparing a simple meal, tidying up, anything to keep my mind occupied and away from thoughts of her. But no matter how hard I tried, she was always there, lurking in the corners of my thoughts, a constant reminder of what I had lost. I had just finished my dinner and was sitting by the window, staring out at the sea as I often did, when I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. After all, I had imagined her so many times before, wishing she would return, only to be disappointed when I realized it was just my mind conjuring up what I longed to see. But as she drew closer, emerging from the water with that same ethereal grace, I knew this time it was real. She was here. My heart leaped in my chest, a mix of fear and hope surging through me with such intensity that I could hardly breathe. Fear, because I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Hope, because despite all my doubts and self-loathing, a part of me had never stopped wanting to see her again. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, as I watched her make her way up the shore, her eyes locked onto mine with a fierce determination that sent shivers down my spine. There was something different about her this time, something that set her apart from the other times we had met. Gone was the cold anger that had once filled her gaze, gone was the playful curiosity that had marked our later encounters. In its place was something new, something more powerful, an unyielding resolve that I could feel even from a distance. She was here for a reason, and I knew, deep down, that nothing would stop her from achieving whatever it was she had come to do. She stopped just a few feet away from me, and for a moment, we simply stared at each other. The air between us was thick with tension, with unspoken words and unacknowledged emotions. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts as I waited to see what she would do. Part of me wanted to run, to hide from the intensity of her gaze, but another part of me, a part one had tried to bury, longed to reach out to her, to bridge the gap that had kept us apart for so long. Then, without warning, she moved. In one fluid motion, she reached out and grabbed the oar that was resting against the side of my cottage, the same where I had used countless times on my fishing trips. Before I could react, she turned and began walking back toward the water, taking the oar with her. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. What was she doing? Was she trying to take away my only means of escape, to trap me here so that I couldn't run from her? But as quickly as the fear rose, it was replaced by something else, an understanding, a realization that she wasn't here to hurt me. She was here to prove something, to make her intentions clear in a way that words never could. I followed her, my heart pounding in my ears as I watched her wade into the water, the oar held tightly in her hand. She moved with purpose, her gaze never leaving mine, as if daring me to turn away, to run from what was about to happen. But I couldn't look away, couldn't bring myself to leave. I was too captivated, too enthralled by the intensity of the moment, by the sheer power of her presence. When she was waist-deep in the water, she paused, turning to face me fully. Then, with a sudden, forceful motion, she plunged the oar into the water, disappearing beneath the surface with it. I stood on the shore, helpless, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. What was she doing? Was this another attempt to frighten me, to test my resolve? Or was it something more, something deeper? I didn't have to wait long for an answer. After what felt like an eternity, she reappeared, emerging from the water with the oar in one hand and something else in the other. My breath caught in my throat as I saw what she was holding, a weathered skull, bleached white by time and the elements. It was an eerie, haunting sight, one that sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't look away. The skull seemed to glow in the fading light, a stark contrast to the darkness of the water around her. She began to walk toward me, her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a mixture of fear and awe as she approached. The intensity in her gaze was almost unbearable, a raw, unfiltered emotion that I had never seen from her before. This was not the same creature I had first encountered on the shore. This was someone who had made a decision, someone who had chosen a path and was now determined to see it through. When she reached the shore, she climbed onto the sand with a grace that belied the weight of what she carried. She moved toward me, each step deliberate, purposeful, as if every moment was leading up to this one. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild, frantic rhythm that matched the storm of emotions inside me. I felt a flicker of fear. What did the skull mean? What was she trying to tell me? But it was quickly overshadowed by a deep, aching hope that this was the moment I had been waiting for. She stopped just a foot away from me, her eyes never leaving mine. The intensity of her gaze was almost too much to bear, but I couldn't look away. Then, slowly, she held out the skull, offering it to me with both hands, as if presenting a precious gift. I stared at the skull, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The skull was old, withered, and it bore the marks of a life that had ended long ago. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else. There was a sense of power, of significance, that radiated from it. It was more than just a relic of the past. It was a symbol, a message, one that she was offering to me in a way that transcended words. In that moment, I understood. The skull was a token, an offering of sorts, but it was also a declaration. She had chosen me, despite everything, despite my fears, my doubts, my insecurities. She had returned not to harm me, but to be with me, to forge a connection that went beyond the physical, beyond the mortal. The skull was her way of showing that she had made her decision, that she was willing to bind herself to me, to share her life, her world, her very essence. Tears welled up in my eyes as the weight of her gesture sank in. She wasn't offering the skull as a threat or a reminder of death. She was offering it as a symbol of her love, her commitment to me. It was a gesture of trust, of acceptance, and in that moment, all the fears and doubts that had plagued me for so long began to melt away. With trembling hands, I reached out and took the skull from her, cradling it gently as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Our fingers brushed as I took it, and the touch sent a jolt of warmth through my entire body. I looked up at her, my vision blurred with tears, and saw the same emotion mirrored in her eyes. There was no fear, no anger, no hesitation, only a deep, unwavering love that I had never thought possible. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. The loneliness, the regret, the self-doubt that had haunted me for so long were gone, replaced by a sense of peace, of belonging. She had chosen me, and in return, I chose her, without reservation, without fear. In that moment, we were bound together, not just by fate or circumstance, but by a love that transcended all the barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of twilight, we stood there on the shore, the skull between us a silent testament to the bond we had forged. And in that quiet, sacred moment, I knew that I had found something worth fighting for, something worth holding onto, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. She had come back to me, and this time, I would never let her go. After that profound moment on the shore, when she offered me the skull as a symbol of her love and commitment, everything changed. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of emotions, possibilities, and unspoken desires that had been building up between us for so long. We had both made our choice, and now, it was time to figure out how to build a life together, despite the many challenges that lay ahead. The first and most pressing challenge was communication. Our connection had always been fraught with misunderstandings and barriers, and while we had managed to reach each other on a deeper level, there was still so much we couldn't express in words or gestures alone. I knew that if we were going to truly be together, we needed to find a way to communicate, to share our thoughts, our feelings, and our experiences. Sign language became our first bridge. I had learned it as a child, a necessity given my deafness and muteness, but it was something entirely new for her. At first, it was difficult, almost frustrating, as she tried to mimic the signs I made, her graceful fingers awkward and unsure in this new form of expression. But she was determined, her eyes bright with focus as she watched my hands intently, repeating each movement until she got it right. We started with simple signs, basic words like hello, yes, no, and love. She picked up on them quickly, her natural grace extending to her hands as she began to grasp the fundamentals. Her progress was astonishing, and soon we were able to communicate in a way that went beyond mere gestures. The first time she signed I love you to me, her fingers forming the words with a hesitant, almost shy precision, I felt a lump rise in my throat. It was a small victory, but it meant the world to me. As the days turned into weeks, our vocabulary expanded. We began to sign more complex ideas, sharing our thoughts and feelings with increasing clarity. She was a quick learner, and her dedication to mastering sign language was a testament to how much she wanted to bridge the gap between us. There were still moments of frustration, moments when a thought or emotion was too complex to express in signs alone, but those moments became fewer as we grew more comfortable with our new language. Alongside sign language, we also began to communicate through reading and writing. I taught her the letters, showing her how to trace them in the sand or on paper, and slowly, she began to understand how the symbols connected to the words she was learning. It was a painstaking process at first, but her determination never wavered. She would spend hours practicing, tracing the letters with her delicate fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration. One day, after weeks of practice, she wrote her first word. It was my name. She had scrawled it in the sand with her finger, her face lit up with pride as she showed it to me. Seeing my name written by her hand, even in its imperfect form, filled me with a warmth I couldn't describe. It was as if, for the first time, I truly existed for her, not just as a presence, but as someone she could name, someone who was a part of her world. As her understanding of written language grew, we began to share more and more through writing. We would sit together in the evenings, her head resting on my shoulder as we passed a small notebook back and forth, writing out our thoughts and questions. Through those written words, we began to share the stories of our pasts, our lives before we met, the experiences that had shaped us, and the loneliness that had defined so much of our existence. She told me of her countless years alone, drifting through the waters, singing to sailors and luring them to their deaths. It was a life she had lived for so long that it had become almost mechanical, a routine born out of necessity rather than desire. She didn't know where she came from or why she was the way she was. There were no memories of a beginning, no others of her kind to share her existence. It was just her, the sea, and the men who crossed her path. As she wrote about her life, I could see the sorrow in her eyes, the deep loneliness that had driven her to do the things she did. She had never wanted to hurt anyone, but the hunger, the need to feed, had always been there, a relentless force that she couldn't control. It was only when she met me, when she found someone who didn't succumb to her song, someone who saw her for who she was, that she began to question that life, to wonder if there could be something more. In turn, I shared my own story, my life of silence, the isolation of being different in a world that didn't understand. I told her about my childhood, about the loneliness of growing up deaf and mute, about the way people had always treated me as if I were broken, incomplete. I told her about the solitude I had embraced as an adult, the way I had chosen to live by the sea, away from others, because it was easier than trying to fit into a world that didn't accept me. As we shared these stories, our connection deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible. We began to understand each other not just as we were now, but as the sum of our pasts, the pain, the loneliness, the longing that had shaped us both. We weren't just two beings brought together by fate, we were two souls who had found in each other a mirror of our own experiences, our own struggles. Our days became filled with quiet moments of learning and discovery. We would walk along the shore, signing to each other as the waves lapped at our feet, or sit together in the cottage, writing out our thoughts in the soft glow of candlelight. There was a peace in these moments, a sense of belonging that I had never known before. I wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. We had found each other, and together, we were building something beautiful, something lasting. The more we communicated, the more I realized that our connection went beyond words or gestures. It was a bond forged in the shared understanding of what it meant to be alone, to be different, to long for something more. It was a bond that grew stronger with each passing day, as we learned to navigate our new life together, as we found new ways to express the love that had brought us to this point. There were still challenges, of course. There were times when I could see the sadness in her eyes, the longing for something she couldn't quite grasp, a connection to a past she couldn't remember, a longing for others like her. But in those moments, I would reach out, take her hand in mine, and remind her that she wasn't alone anymore. We had each other, and that was enough. As we continued to build our life together, the walls that had once separated us crumbled away. We became partners, not just in the physical sense, but in every way that mattered. We learned to trust each other, to rely on each other, to share our hopes and fears without reservation. And in doing so, we created a life that was filled with love, understanding, and a deep, abiding connection that transcended all the barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable. Looking back now, I can see how far we've come, how much we've grown together. What started as a chance encounter on a lonely shore has blossomed into a life filled with love, acceptance, and a connection that defies explanation. We've learned to communicate, not just with words and signs, but with our hearts, with the understanding that comes from truly seeing and accepting each other for who we are. And as we continue to walk this path together, I know that whatever challenges may come, we'll face them together, because we've found in each other something rare, something precious. We've found a love that transcends the ordinary, a love that is rooted in the deepest parts of our souls. And that is a love that will endure, no matter what the future may hold. The life we created together in our secluded cottage by the sea was unlike anything I could have ever imagined. It was a world unto itself, a place where the outside world and its judgments no longer mattered. Here, it was just the two of us, two beings who had found solace and love in each other's company, despite the immense challenges that came with our unique circumstances. Our cottage was small, nestled at the edge of the forest where the trees met the rocky shoreline. It was a place of quiet beauty, with the sound of the waves constantly in the background, a soothing reminder of the sea that had brought us together. The cottage itself was simple, but it was ours, filled with the little things that made it feel like home. We had decorated it with things we found on the beach, driftwood, smooth stones, shells, and each piece told a story of our shared journey. In this secluded haven, we created a routine that was uniquely our own. Our days were filled with the simple pleasures of a life removed from the hustle and noise of the world. We would wake early, often before the sun had fully risen, and take long walks along the shore, the sand cooled beneath our feet as we signed and talked about our dreams, our plans, and the memories we were making together. We spent much of our time tending to the garden we had planted just outside the cottage, a small patch of earth where we grew vegetables and herbs. It was a labor of love, something we nurtured together, watching with pride as the plants flourished under our care. The garden was a symbol of the life we were building, something rooted in the earth, yet growing toward the light, nourished by the love we shared. Inside the cottage, we filled our days with the quiet companionship that had become the cornerstone of our relationship. We would sit by the fire in the evenings, her head resting on my shoulder as we passed a notebook back and forth, writing out our thoughts, our stories, our reflections on the day. We communicated not just through words, but through touch, through shared glances, through the unspoken understanding that had grown between us. There was a peace in these moments, a deep contentment that I had never known before. But as idyllic as our life was, there was still the matter of her need to feed, a reality that we could not ignore, no matter how much we wished otherwise. She was not like other beings, she required sustenance that the sea alone could not provide. It was a hunger that had driven her for as long as she could remember, one that had shaped her existence and brought her into contact with countless men who had not survived the encounter. When we first began our life together, this need was a source of great tension and fear. I knew what she was capable of, what she had done to survive, and I feared that this part of her nature would drive a wedge between us, that it would be something we could never reconcile. But as with everything else, we faced it together, determined to find a way to make it work without losing what we had built. We talked about it, honestly, openly, and without judgment. She shared with me the pain and loneliness that came with her need, the way it had always set her apart from others, turning her into something to be feared rather than loved. She had never wanted to hurt anyone, but the hunger was something she couldn't deny, something that would always be a part of her. In those conversations, I could see the weight of her burden, the sorrow in her eyes as she spoke of the lives she had taken. But I also saw her determination to change, to find a way to balance her need with the life we were building together. She didn't want to lose what we had any more than I did, and together, we were committed to finding a solution. We began by seeking out those who would not be missed, men who had strayed too far from the safety of the shore, those with darkness in their hearts, whose loss would bring no tears. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a compromise that allowed her to feed without bringing harm to the innocent. It was a delicate balance, one that required vigilance and care, but it was a balance we were willing to maintain for the sake of our love. Each time she fed, she would return to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. I would hold her close, comforting her as best I could, reassuring her that she was still the woman I loved, that nothing could change that. It was a difficult aspect of our life together, one that tested our bond in ways I hadn't anticipated, but it also deepened our connection, forcing us to confront the realities of who we were and what we meant to each other. Over time, we learned to live with this aspect of her nature, accepting it as part of the complex tapestry of our relationship. It became another thread woven into the fabric of our life together, something that didn't define us, but was simply one part of the whole. We found ways to make it work, to ensure that her needs were met without compromising the love we shared. And through it all, our love only grew stronger. The trust we had in each other, the way we faced each challenge together, solidified the bond between us. We were partners in every sense of the word, navigating the complexities of our unique situation with grace and understanding. Our secluded cottage became a sanctuary, a place where we could be ourselves without fear of judgment, where we could live our lives on our own terms. As the years passed, we settled into a rhythm that was uniquely ours. Our days were filled with the simple joys of a life well lived, the laughter, the shared stories, the quiet moments of reflection by the fire. We became each other's world, a world that was small, yes, but rich in love and understanding. The outside world, with all its noise and chaos, became a distant memory, something that no longer mattered in the face of what we had built together. In our secluded cottage, we created a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary, a life where love and necessity coexisted in a delicate balance, where we found joy in the small things and strength in each other. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when the weight of our circumstances felt almost too much to bear, but we always found a way through. Because in the end, we had each other, and that was enough. And as I sit here now, looking out at the sea that has been both our friend and our foe, I know that we made the right choice. We chose each other, despite everything, and in doing so, we created a life that is ours alone, a life built on love, trust, and the unbreakable bond that comes from facing the world together, no matter what it might throw at us. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?